Imagine waking up one morning to find your dream home turned into a prison, not by nature, not by chance, but by the hands of your neighbors, armed with rules, arrogance, and a padlock you don't own. This is the story of Tony Jack, a rancher who refused to be caged in. What followed was a battle of wills, one man against an entire homeowners association, in a fight that would expose corruption, ignite a community, and end in a twist no one ever expected. The morning began like any other on Tony Jack's ranch. A faint mist hung low over the rolling fields outside Abilene, Texas. The smell of damp soil mixed with the earthy scent of cattle grazing beyond the pasture. Tony stepped onto his porch, steaming mug of black coffee in hand, and let out a satisfied breath. This was why he had left the city. The quiet mornings, the rhythm of ranch life, the sound of cattle lowing against the breeze. But on this morning, March 3rd, 6:12 a.m., something was wrong. His eyes caught the glint of steel in the distance. He squinted, setting his mug carefully on the porch rail. There, cutting across the land like a scar, stood a brand new fence. Not the weathered wood and wire fencing he was used to. This was modern, gleaming, and deliberate. A locked steel gate stood at the only access point to the county road. Hanging from it was a heavy padlock and a stark metal sign that says, "Property access managed by Lakeside Meadows HOA." For a moment, Tony couldn't move. His herd of cattle wandered nearby, penned in like zoo animals. Beyond the fence lay the creek, their only steady water source, and the road that connected him to town. And now, both were cut off. "Hell no," Tony muttered under his breath, jaw tightening. He climbed off the porch and strode toward the gate, boots crunching in the gravel. By the time he arrived, two men in crisp HOA polo shirts were already tightening bolts, working like hired muscle. "Morning," Tony called, his voice low but sharp. "Mind telling me what this is?" Neither looked up. One muttered, "Talk to the board." Tony's fists clenched. He was about to press further when the sound of tires crunching gravel pulled his attention. A spotless silver SUV rolled up. Out stepped Marjorie Kane, the HOA president. She was dressed like she was headed for a courtroom, not a ranch. Tailored suit, glossy heels that didn't belong anywhere near dirt, clipboard tucked under her arm, sunglasses perched high on her face. "Mr. Jack," she said coolly, skipping any greeting, "you've been notified of your non-compliance issues." Tony blinked. "Non-compliance with what?" She smiled, a thin, icy curve. "Perimeter fencing must match community standards. Yours does not. Until it's corrected, this measure will prevent further violations." Tony's chest burned. He gestured toward the cattle, milling anxiously by the fence. "That's my access road. My animals need water from the creek down there, and that," he jabbed a finger at the gate, "isn't your land." Her smile didn't falter. "The access easement is controlled by the HOA. It's in the covenant you agreed to when you purchased the property." Tony felt a knot twist in his stomach. He remembered the towering stack of papers he had signed at closing, page after page of legal language no normal man could fully understand. "You mean to tell me," he growled, "you can lock me in until I build a fence that looks pretty enough for you?" "Correct," she replied briskly, already turning back to her SUV. "Contact our office when you're ready to discuss approved fencing styles. Have a pleasant day." The lock clanged shut. The SUV's tires kicked up dust as she drove off. The workers packed their tools and left without a word. Tony stood alone at the gate, fists on his hips, the cool breeze tugging at his shirt. He had faced droughts, blizzards, and rising feed costs, but never this. Never someone so determined to choke the life out of his dream with a smile and a clipboard. That night, Tony sat at his kitchen table staring at the pile of mail he hadn't bothered to open. Across from him sat Glenn Porter, a retired trucker with a weathered face and a voice like gravel. "They've been doing this for years," Glenn said, sipping black coffee. "Marjorie's got the board wrapped around her finger. If she don't like you, she'll bleed you dry with fines and rules." Tony rubbed his temples. "I didn't leave Amarillo just to get pushed around by a committee and press shirts." "Then you'd better be ready for a fight," Glenn warned, "because she won't hand you that key unless you kneel. And Tony, she don't lose." Tony leaned back, staring at the ceiling. His calloused hands curled into fists. He wasn't sure how far this would go, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't bow. The land wasn't just dirt and grass. It was years of saving, years of sweat. It was his dream. And he wasn't about to let someone with a silver SUV and a stack of rules bury it. The next morning, Tony drove into town and bought a thick file folder. He began collecting every letter, every photo, every scrap of evidence related to his property. If Marjorie wanted a fight, he'd get one. But Tony had no idea just how far she was willing to go. He didn't know that what began as a locked gate would turn into a war that would spill into courtrooms, newspapers, and late-night whispers among neighbors too afraid to take sides. And as he walked into the Lakeside Meadows clubhouse 2 days later, the room already packed with curious eyes, he could feel it in his gut. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. This was about control. And in that moment, Tony Jack realized something chilling. Marjorie Kane wasn't playing a game. She was playing for keeps. The Lakeside Meadows clubhouse smelled of old carpet, burnt coffee, and something else: tension. Every seat in the narrow room was taken. The chatter of neighbors hushed as Tony Jack pushed open the door. Heads turned, some curious, some sympathetic, most afraid. At the front sat 6 board members behind a long folding table. Their papers were neatly stacked, water bottles lined up like soldiers. And at the center, wearing a tailored navy blazer and a pearl necklace that shimmered under the fluorescent lights, sat Marjorie Kane. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. She simply adjusted her clipboard and spoke into the microphone, her voice amplified and cold. "Mr. Jack," she said, before the meeting even officially began, "you will be addressed under compliance matters." The words sliced through the room like a knife. Tony felt every pair of eyes shift toward him as he sat in the back row, his boots echoing against the thin carpet. For 40 minutes, he listened in silence. Landscaping disputes, pool hour complaints, an argument over mailbox colors. Mundane chatter, all while he stared at the packet they'd handed him at the door. Pages upon pages of rules, paint colors, driveway lengths, even what kind of lawn ornaments were acceptable. When his name was finally called, the room quieted. Tony rose slowly, his tall frame cutting a shadow across the aisle as he walked forward. Each step was deliberate, his boots thudding against the floor. When he reached the microphone, he let the silence hang before he spoke. "Let's talk about that fence you built," Marjorie began. Tony placed a folder of documents on the table. His voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp. "It's the same fence I've used for years on my last property. It's safe, it's functional, it keeps my cattle in." Marjorie adjusted her blazer, her tone brisk. "Functional is not the standard here. Community aesthetics are. Perimeter fencing must be uniform, and yours does not meet approved specifications." Tony's jaw tightened. "This is a ranch, not a golf course. My cattle need strong fencing, not decorative posts to please your eye." A man at the far end of the table cleared his throat. "Rules are rules, sir. If we made exceptions for you, we'd have to make them for everyone." Tony leaned forward,
his voice rising just enough to carry. "You already do make exceptions. 3 houses on my street have fences that don't match your standards. None of them have padlocks on their gates. Why me?" A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Several neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Marjorie's lips curled into a thin smile. "Those cases are under review. You remain out of compliance. Fines will continue until your fencing is corrected." Tony flipped open his folder, pulling out photographs of his cattle pressed against the fence. He slid them across the table. "You've cut off access to my water source. That's not just wrong, it's dangerous. These animals depend on that creek. You're interfering with my livelihood." Marjorie didn't even glance at the photos. "You have other water sources. We confirmed it with satellite imagery." Tony barked a humorless laugh. "Satellite imagery? You think you can tell from a picture how I run my ranch?" The audience stirred, whispers louder now. From the second row, Glenn Porter raised his hand. "Marjorie, the man's only been here a few weeks. Maybe give him time to settle before you lock his road and slap him with fines?" Marjorie's head snapped toward him. "The HOA must maintain standards, Mr. Porter. If Mr. Jack wishes to be part of this community, he must abide by the same rules as everyone else." Tony's hands pressed against the table. "And if I don't?" The room went silent. Marjorie leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Then fines will escalate, and if necessary, legal action." The words landed like a gavel. Tony picked up his folder and returned to his seat, but inside his chest burned. He could feel the board's power pressing down, the fear they had cultivated tightening around the room. After the meeting ended, several neighbors approached him quietly. One woman whispered, "We're rooting for you," before darting away like she had said something forbidden. Others avoided him altogether, eyes downcast as if contact with him might invite punishment. Outside, the night air was thick and humid. Glenn caught up to him in the parking lot. "She's not just strict," Glenn muttered. "She's got friends on the county zoning board, family in real estate. People think twice before crossing her." Tony looked back at the glowing windows of the clubhouse. Through the glass, he saw Marjorie laughing with a tall man in a suit, shaking hands like they'd just closed a deal. "I'm not playing her game," Tony said, his voice low but steady. "If she wants a battle, I'll give her one she's not ready for." He climbed into his truck, the engine growling to life, but his gut twisted with unease. This wasn't just about fines. It wasn't just about fences. This was about power, hers, and his refusal to bend to it. That night, back at the ranch, the storm truly began. His mailbox overflowed with official-looking envelopes, each stamped HOA Compliance Office. The fines were relentless, $50 a day, then $100. Claims that his fencing was detrimental to community appeal. Tony read one aloud, slamming it onto the table. "Visual inconsistency? I'm raising cattle, not hosting weddings." Glenn chuckled grimly. "They know exactly what they're doing. They'll bleed you dry until you fold." Tony stared out the window into the dark fields where his cattle moved restlessly under the stars. Something inside him hardened. He wasn't going to fold.
But even as he vowed to fight, he didn't realize how personal and how public this war was about to become. Because the next morning, as Tony approached the locked gate again, he noticed something new. A wooden stake hammered into the ground, a laminated sign fluttering in the wind. "For sale." Tony froze. His mind raced. The half-acre strip of land containing the locked gate wasn't owned by him or the HOA. It was a separate lot. If he owned that strip, he'd own the gate, and the lock that Marjorie used to control him would be his. Tony's pulse quickened. The opportunity was clear, but so was the danger. If Marjorie learned of his plan, she'd crush it before he had a chance. He pulled out his phone, already scrolling through contacts, searching for someone he could trust. But as he turned back toward the ranch, a flicker of headlights glared across the road. A silver SUV slowed at the edge of his property, pausing just long enough for him to know exactly who was watching: Marjorie Kane. And in that instant, Tony Jack understood. Whatever move he made next, she would be ready. The for sale sign was more than an opportunity. It was a trap waiting to be sprung, and Tony Jack had to decide: move fast and risk everything, or wait and watch Marjorie tighten the lock around his life until there was no way out.
The wooden stake with its laminated sign seemed harmless enough at first glance. For sale, it read in bold black letters, the contact number printed neatly beneath. But to Tony Jack, standing in the morning breeze with his boots sinking into the dirt, it wasn't just a sign, it was a lifeline. That thin strip of land, barely half an acre, wasn't part of his ranch, nor technically HOA property. It was a forgotten sliver of ground, sitting between him and freedom. And whoever owned it controlled the only gateway in or out. Tony crouched, his hand brushing over the stake. He could almost feel the weight of a key turning in his palm, a key that would cut the leash of the HOA from his neck. But almost as quickly as hope bloomed, unease gnawed at him. Marjorie Kane wasn't stupid. She'd noticed the sign. She'd noticed his interest. And if she caught even a whisper of his intentions, she'd snap the land up before he could. Move too slow and she'll box you in forever. Move too fast and she'll smell blood. That afternoon, he drove into Abilene, his old Ford rattling along the highway, and pulled up outside a modest brick office. The brass plate read, Thomas Beard, attorney at law. Inside, the air was thick with paper and stale coffee. Beard himself was an older man with thinning hair, spectacles perched low, and the kind of handshake that spoke of decades spent poring over deeds and disputes. Tony laid the photos, notices, and HOA letters across the desk. I need to know if what they're doing is even legal, and if I buy that gate lot, does it give me full control? Beard flipped slowly through the paperwork, tapping his pen against the desk. Well, bad news first. The HOA is operating within the covenants you signed when you purchased. They've got broad authority, broader than most people realize, and the fines, they're enforceable. Tony's shoulders sagged, the air tightening in his chest. So I'm trapped? Beard shook his head. Not necessarily. If that parcel is privately owned and not legally tied to the HOA, then yes, buying it would give you exclusive control. The gate, the access, everything.
Tony's jaw tightened. Then that's my play. Careful, Beard warned. If Marjorie catches wind, she could derail the sale. You'll need someone else to buy it in her place, a proxy, someone the HOA won't suspect. Tony left the office with his mind racing. On the drive back, the fields blurred past his window, but his thoughts were sharp, calculating. He had one man in mind, Brett Lawson, an old college buddy turned property manager, someone with no ties to Lakeside Meadows. That night, in the quiet of his kitchen, Tony made the call. Brett, he said when his friend picked up, I need you to set up an LLC, quietly. I'll fund it, but it has to look like you're the buyer. Nobody can trace it back to me until it's done. Brett whistled low. Sounds like you're cooking up trouble, Jack. Tony glanced out the window, the silver moonlight casting shadows across his restless cattle. No, I'm cooking up freedom. Days passed in a tense rhythm. Tony worked his ranch as usual, feeding cattle, mending posts, but his mind was never far from the gate. Each envelope from the HOA felt heavier, the fines now climbing toward financial suffocation. Each letter carried Marjorie's fingerprints, her icy smile hidden behind formal language. Neighbors watched him differently, too. Some with sympathy, others with suspicion. Word was spreading. Ridley, the outsider, was challenging the queen of the HOA. One evening,
Glenn arrived with a cooler of beer, leaning on the porch rail as the sun set in streaks of crimson. "You're quieter than usual," Glenn said, popping open a bottle. Tony smirked faintly. "That's because I'm planning. And if I told you what I'm planning, I'd have to swear you to secrecy." Glenn raised his bottle. "My lips are sealed." Tony outlined his scheme in hushed tones. By the time he finished, Glenn was grinning wide. "Damn, Jack, that's bold. If you pull it off, you'll turn the whole board upside down."
But Marjorie wasn't blind. Over the next week, she showed up near the fence more often, clipboard in hand, sometimes flanked by other board members. They'd loomer by the gate, whispering, their eyes darting toward Tony like hawks circling prey. One afternoon, she approached directly. Her heels clicked against the gravel as she stopped at the gate. "Mr. Jack," she said crisply, "we've scheduled another compliance inspection for next week." Tony, hammering a fence post, didn't look up. "Schedule all you want. My fence isn't changing." "You're only making things harder for yourself," she replied. Finally, he straightened, meeting her gaze. "And you're underestimating me." For the first time, Marjorie's mask cracked, a flicker of irritation in her eyes. Without a word, she turned and walked back to her SUV. The following morning, Brett called. His voice was steady but urgent. The seller accepted the offer, no counter, closing in 3 weeks. Tony's grip tightened on the phone. Relief surged through him, but so did caution. 3 weeks is a long time, too long. "You'll need to keep calm," Brett said. "If the HOA sniffs this out, they'll do everything to kill the deal." Tony hung up and leaned against the fence, staring at the padlocked gate. 3 weeks. 3 weeks until everything changed or collapsed. But keeping secrets in a small town was like trying to hold water in your hands. Word leaked fast. That weekend, Paula Green, the neighbor who had once warned him about Marjorie, caught him in the grocery store aisle. She leaned close, her voice barely above a whisper. "Careful, Tony. I heard the board's been talking to a surveyor about that gate lot. They know something's moving." Tony's pulse quickened. The clock was ticking faster now. He called Brett that night. "We need to move sooner. Push the title company. Get escrow open this week." By Friday, Brett delivered. "It's done," he said over the phone. "Escrow's open, deposits down. Unless you back out, this land is yours." Tony exhaled slowly, staring across his fields at the silver gate gleaming under the setting sun. For the first time in weeks, victory felt close. But he didn't celebrate, not yet. Because he knew Marjorie. She wasn't going to let this go quietly. And he was right. 2 days later, Tony drove past the gate lot to find something that made his stomach drop. The for sale sign was gone. In its place was a new stake, freshly hammered into the dirt. A laminated notice fluttered in the wind, stamped with the HOA seal. "Pending review. Community easement proposal." Tony froze, his knuckles whitening on the steering wheel. Marjorie had moved. She wasn't just watching anymore. She was making her countermove. And if she succeeded, his plan, his key to freedom, would shatter before it ever reached his hands. Tony thought buying the gate would end the fight. But now, as the HOA launched its counterattack, he realized this wasn't just about a piece of land anymore. It was about survival. And Marjorie Kane wasn't finished tightening the noose. The laminated notice fluttered in the wind like a taunt. Pending review, community easement proposal. Tony Jack stood at the edge of the gate lot, fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. He had moved quickly, faster than most men would have dared, securing escrow on the sliver of land that contained the gate. But Marjorie Kane was moving just as fast, dragging the HOA board behind her like an army. She wasn't giving up the chokehold without a fight. Tony ripped the notice from the stake and crumpled it in his fist. He knew what it meant. The HOA was claiming the right to turn his newly purchased land into shared access, a bureaucratic loophole that, if approved, would strip his control before the ink was even dry on his deed. Back at the ranch, Glenn Porter found him pacing the porch, the paper crushed in his hand.
"She's hitting back hard," Glenn muttered after reading it. "If she can turn that strip into an easement, you've bought yourself nothing but a headache." Tony's jaw tightened. Then she's not gonna get it. 2 days later, the fight exploded into public view. Tony was hauling feed into the ranch when a pair of sheriff's trucks pulled up near the gate. Dust rolled off the tires as 2 uniformed deputies stepped out. Behind them, Marjorie's silver SUV gleamed like a predator waiting for blood. "Morning, Mr. Jack," one deputy said cautiously. "We got a call about a property dispute." Tony climbed down from his truck, paperwork already in hand. "This lot's in escrow. I've got the contract. Nothing illegal happening here." Marjorie crossed her arms, her sunglasses hiding her eyes. "She's interfering with HOA access. That gate has always been under our authority." Tony held out the contract. "Not anymore." The deputy studied the papers, his brow furrowing. Finally, he looked up at Marjorie. "Ma'am, until the courts decide, he's within his rights." Marjorie's smile was thin, brittle. "Then we'll see him in court." She turned sharply and strode back to her SUV, her heels crunching the gravel. But the damage was done. Neighbors had gathered along the road, whispering in clusters, watching like it was a small-town spectacle. Some gave Tony nods of encouragement. Others avoided his eyes, afraid of choosing sides.
Tony felt the shift in the air. This was no longer private. The whole community was watching. Within days, the HOA went on the offensive. Tony's mailbox filled with certified letters stamped compliance enforcement. Social media pages lit up with debates, neighbors arguing whether he was a hero or a troublemaker. At the feed store, strangers shook his hand. At the grocery store, others glared as though he were tearing the neighborhood apart. The story spread fast. A local newspaper ran the headline, "Rancher battles HOA over locked gate." A photo of Tony leaning on the fence, arms crossed, made him look like a man standing his ground. The article was neutral, but the picture told its own story. That night, his lawyer, Thomas Beard, leaned across his desk, his voice low and serious. "They're preparing to sue, Jack. If you lose, you don't just lose the gate. You'll drown in fines, legal fees, maybe even lose the ranch itself." Tony's expression hardened. "Then I can't lose." The next week, tension boiled over at the Lakeside Meadows clubhouse. The board had called an emergency session. The room was packed, neighbors filling every chair, and the hum of whispered conversations buzzing like hornets. Marjorie wasted no time. "Recent events," she declared, "have exposed dangerous gaps in our authority. We are proposing an amendment, granting the HOA legal control over any access points that serve multiple properties." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Tony raised his hand, his voice cutting through the noise. "That's convenient, isn't it? A brand new rule written just to target me." Marjorie's eyes glinted. "This is about the community as a whole, Mr. Jack, not you." "Don't lie to them," Tony shot back. "You want to strip me of the land I legally bought. If this amendment passes, none of you will be safe. Today it's me, tomorrow it could be your shed, your driveway, your property."
The room erupted, neighbors arguing, some shouting over each other. The board called for order, but the division was clear. For the first time, Marjorie's iron grip showed cracks. When the vote was called, the board split, 3 in favor, 2 against. The amendment couldn't pass without homeowner approval. The battle was far from over. As Tony left the clubhouse, Paula Green caught his arm. Her voice trembled, but her words were firm. "You're not the first person she's tried to break, but you might be the first who can beat her. Don't back down." But Marjorie wasn't backing down either. Late one night, Glenn showed up at Tony's porch, carrying a plain envelope. He said, "Found this slipped under my door." Inside was a single sheet of paper. No name, no return address, just 5 typed words. "Check the county filings tomorrow." The next morning, Tony drove to the county clerk's office. When the clerk pulled the latest filings, Tony's stomach dropped. There it was in black ink. Notice of intent to purchase. Applicant, Lakeside Meadows HOA. The land wasn't the gate lot. He had already locked that down. This was worse. It was a narrow strip of county land running alongside his fence. If the HOA bought it, they could carve out a brand new access road, bypassing his gate entirely. His leverage, his one advantage, would vanish overnight. Tony gripped the paper so hard that it crumpled. Marjorie wasn't just fighting him, she was trying to outflank him. He stormed back into Beard's office, slamming the filing onto the lawyer's desk. "She's trying to box me in again," Tony said, his voice tight with fury. "If she gets that strip, my win means nothing."
Beard read it slowly, nodding. "It's clever, I'll give her that, but not impossible to stop. That land is county-owned for now. We can object, file motions, buy time, maybe even block the sale altogether." Tony leaned forward, his eyes burning with determination. "Do it, whatever it costs, do it." Beard sighed, already pulling forms from his cabinet. "This just went from a property dispute to war, Jack, and once it's in court, there's no turning back." That night, Tony sat on his porch, the cool wind brushing against his face. His cattle were quiet, their silhouettes shifting gently under the moon. But peace was an illusion. In the distance, headlights flickered. A silver SUV paused on the road, engine idling, before slowly driving away. Tony knew who it was. Marjorie Kane. Watching, waiting, planning her next strike. And as Tony tightened his grip on the bottle in his hand, he realized something chilling. The fight wasn't just about a fence anymore. It wasn't even about a gate. It was about survival. And the next battleground would be the courthouse. When the judge's gavel finally fell, it wouldn't just decide who owned a strip of land. It would decide whether Tony Jack's dream lived or died, and whether one community would finally break free from fear. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and tension. Rows of benches filled quickly that Tuesday morning. Neighbors from Lakeside Meadows crowding into the chamber, whispering like they were waiting for a prize fight. Some wore cautious smiles, others crossed their arms with suspicion. At the front sat the judge, stern and unreadable. To his left, the HOA board in a neat line, flanking their queen, Marjorie Kane. She was immaculate as always. Navy dress, pearl earrings, hair pinned sharp enough to cut glass. She didn't glance Tony's way once. And then there was Tony Jack, calloused hands folded on the table before him, boots polished but scuffed at the toe. His lawyer, Thomas Beard, sat beside him, flipping calmly through the thick stack of files they had prepared. When the gavel fell, the room snapped into silence. "Case 2751, the judge announced. Lakeside Meadows Homeowners Association versus Tony Jack. The matter concerns property rights and alleged impropriety in the sale of a parcel containing community access." The attorney of the HOA rose first. A slick man with slicker hair, he launched into a speech that sounded rehearsed. "The HOA," he began, "has maintained authority over this access point for years. The defendant, Mr. Jack, interfered with community management by purchasing the parcel through deceptive means. We argue the transaction is invalid." He painted Tony as a troublemaker, a man who didn't respect rules, who sought to undermine the very fabric of the neighborhood. As he spoke, Marjorie sat tall, her lips curved in a smug, knowing smile. When it was Beard's turn, he rose slowly, adjusting his glasses. "Your Honor, this case is not about community integrity. It is about power, and one association president's abuse of it. My client purchased the parcel legally. The HOA had every opportunity to exercise first refusal and chose not to. Now, because they don't like the outcome, they are trying to rewrite the rules retroactively. That is not law. That is tyranny." The courtroom hummed with energy. Tony sat still, eyes fixed on Marjorie. She didn't move, but her jaw tightened. Witnesses were called. First, an HOA board member who hesitated under questioning. Beard pressed him gently. "Did you ever review other non-compliant fences in the neighborhood?" The man swallowed. "Yes.
And were fines issued to those homeowners? No.
So why only to Mr. Jack? The man's eyes flicked nervously toward Marjorie. The board prioritized cases. A ripple of whispers spread across the benches. Then came Paula Green, her voice trembling but steady. She told the court about the tree she had been forced to cut down, the endless letters, the threats of fines. We all lived in fear, she said, glancing toward Marjorie. Most of us stayed quiet, but Tony didn't. When Glenn Porter took the stand, he leaned forward, gravel in his voice. I've lived in Lakeside Meadows 20 years. I've seen folks bullied out of their homes because they couldn't keep up with Marjorie's rules. Tony's the first man to stand his ground, and I say it's about damn time. The room erupted in murmurs until the judge banged his gavel for silence. Finally, Tony himself was called. He stood tall, clearing his throat. I bought my ranch for peace, for work, for land I could call my own. And from the first week, the HOA tried to box me in. They locked my cattle off from water, fined me for fences that work better than anything they approve, and tried to bleed me dry. I didn't buy this land to fight with my neighbors, but when someone puts a lock on your dream, you don't walk away. You find the key. His words hung heavy in the silence. Even the judge's pen paused mid-scribble. By the third day, the case had become a spectacle. Local reporters stood outside the courthouse, microphones ready. Editorials filled the paper. Rancher versus HOA president. Who holds the key? On the final morning, both sides gave closing arguments. The lawyer of the HOA warned of chaos and inconsistency if Tony's ownership was upheld. Beard, calm but sharp, looked the judge dead in the eye. Your Honor, this case is about whether rules can be twisted to crush an individual. Mr. Jack followed the law. He purchased legally. The authority of the HOA stops where ownership begins, and no board, no matter how powerful, should be allowed to take what isn't theirs.
The courtroom stilled as the judge shuffled his notes. His voice was steady, but each word seemed to fall with the weight of a hammer. This court finds that the sale of the parcel was valid. The title stands. Mr. Jack is the rightful owner of the gate lot. The HOA has no authority over the property. Furthermore, the court orders the HOA to cover the defendant's legal fees. For a moment, silence. And then the room erupted. Gasps, cheers, even applause. Glenn slapped the bench, grinning wide. Paula let out a breath like she'd been holding it for years. Even those who had stayed silent leaned toward Tony, some nodding, some smiling cautiously. Marjorie sat frozen. Her polished smile was gone, her face pale. When she finally stood, her heels clicked furiously against the floor, each step like a retreat. Tony remained still for a beat, letting it sink in. Then he allowed himself the smallest of smiles. He had won. That evening, back at the ranch, Tony walked to the gate. The sun was sinking low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold. His cattle grazed freely near the creek, their low calls blending with the rustle of grass. He pulled the heavy silver key from his pocket and turned it in the lock. The shackle popped open with a sharp metallic snap. For the first time, there was no dread in the sound, only freedom. Glenn joined him, carrying 2 cold beers. He handed one over, clapping Tony's shoulder. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Tony nodded, gazing across his land. "It's more than good. It's knowing no one can fence me in unless I let them." The 2 men sat on the porch as night settled, the crickets beginning their chorus. Tony leaned back, finally at ease. But it wasn't just his victory. It was a shift in the air. At the next HOA meeting, neighbors spoke louder, questioned harder. Fear had cracked. Marjorie still sat at the table, but her voice carried less weight, her eyes darting nervously. Tony had done more than win a lawsuit. He had broken a spell. Tony's words lingered. Every one of us has a locked gate in our lives, something or someone trying to keep us penned in. The truth is simple. You don't have to accept it. You can fight back. And when you finally hold the key in your own hand, there's no better feeling in the world. So if this story struck a chord with you, if it reminded you that no one has the right to fence in your life, don't just walk away now. Hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs courage today, and subscribe for more real stories of justice, freedom, and the power of standing your ground. Because your voice matters, your rights matter, and sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to bow to break the lock for everyone.